I find that a lot of countries in Africa are still teaching history from a European perspective. Is that when you start talking about history, you start talking about it from the time Vasco da Gama came. Or if I were to go to Uganda, you would start talking about Stanley and Livingstone, or a man named Speke. Now there are African people, the San, the Khoi, who have been in South Africa for 40,000 years, but it seems like the history of South Africa is taught from the time the Dutch and the Germans came. I think that we have a long way to go in general. And I respect all well-meaning people, whatever their race is. But I think that we have to realize that this is a long process, and that the situation that we find ourselves in didn't start yesterday, and no matter how hard we work, it's not going to end tomorrow. It will take generations. And I think it will require sacrifice and the willingness for people to be honest. If other people can be compensated for crimes committed against them, then why shouldn't African people be compensated for it? It was seen that there were multiple migrations from Africa to the Americas over the millennia. I mean, after all, if there could be multiple European migrations, and Africa is closer to America than Europe is, and the currents from West Africa take you to America whether you like it or not, it seems only logical that Africans, including people from the Mali Empire, could have very easily ended up in ancient America.
For me to know, how would you see the South Africa of today? I don't know when last you've been there, if you've ever been.
A month and a half ago.
Yes. And can you give me an idea of what you would say you know what our problems are, but how would we go about it?
Redistribute the land. Start there. Now, I've lectured in South Africa. I did a big lecture in Johannesburg a number of years ago. I've been to South Africa 3 times. A short visit to Cape Town, a short visit to Johannesburg, and just recently, most of the time I was there this summer, I was in Namibia, neighboring South Africa. And there were people who tried to get me to lecture again, but it met a lot of opposition from the universities. I got the impression that a lot of people don't want to rock the boat in terms of having a new parameters in terms of African history. I find that a lot of countries in Africa are still teaching history from a European perspective. So that if, for example, if I were to go to Ghana, I hope I'm wrong, but the impression I've gotten, and I've been in Ghana 10 times, is that when you start talking about history, you start talking about it from the time Vasco da Gama came. Or if I were to go to Uganda, you would start talking about Stanley and Livingstone, or a man named Speke. Now there are African people, the San, the Khoi, who have been in South Africa for 40,000 years, but it seems like the history of South Africa is taught from the time the Dutch and the Germans came. And so it seems to me that although apartheid has officially ended, the vestiges of apartheid are still there, and they exist in the educational system. I think that we have a long way to go in general. And I respect all well-meaning people, whatever their race is. But I think that we have to realize that this is a long process, and that the situation that we find ourselves in didn't start yesterday, and no matter how hard we work, it's not going to end tomorrow. It will take generations. And I think it will require sacrifice and the willingness for people to be honest.
My question is, I want to know your point of view about collective African interest, and the other issue is, what do you think about reparation?
You know, I really would have preferred tonight that we talk about history. I'm a historian, and a lot of these are hot-button issues. Of course I believe in reparations. You know, if other people can be compensated for crimes committed against them, then why shouldn't African people be compensated for it? And I think we begin to deflect. For example, if we start talking about the transatlantic slave trade, somebody is bound to, including Africans themselves, say, well, didn't Africans enslave other Africans? And so somehow that absolves, you know, the wrongs that have been done to Africans by Europeans. So, of course, I believe in reparations, but I also believe that Africans must have the power to enforce reparations, because it will not be given to Africans on the basis of morality or it's the right thing. Otherwise, it would have been done a long time ago. So, yeah, I believe in reparations, but I think that the struggle now has to be to empower Africans so that they can enforce reparations.
Otalia, I'm from Cote d'Ivoire, and I'm Jula, so from the Bambara, let's say.
Simorodo.
Not tribe. And so from the oral tradition, we say that we originated from the Nile, so somehow Nile Valley, more or less from Kush. And I would like to know is there really evidence so that we really come from this part to Mali? I mean, the Mali Kaiser, the Mali Empire. But my tribe is more from the Ghana Empire, and then we continue. And from that also we have like Sundiata Keita, but also Kankou Moussa, and they say that the brother of Kankou Moussa tried somehow to go to America, so let's say Latin America. And is there a proof that they never know, so they never say that he arrived there, they didn't have like the proof that he arrived there, but they believe that he arrived there. And you were talking about at the beginning also from this population coming from Africa to Latin America. Is there proof that those population, so Bambara population, could have been also in Latin America?
Possibly, but that's a legend. We're talking about
it's
the legend of Abubakar II, who, according to the tradition in Mali, he is the predecessor of Mansa Kankan Musa, who is very famous. I guess everybody's heard of Mansa Musa if you've heard of anybody in the history of Africa. He is supposed to have built a fleet of ships that sailed across the Atlantic. And the story goes, for those who may not be aware of it, one day the emperor, the king, is holding court, and one of the captains returns from one of the ships. And he tells the emperor, he tells Abubakar II, I was the captain of the last ship. And all the ships before me seemed to get caught on a current, and I became afraid and came back. And so Abubakar is so excited that he builds an even larger fleet of ships, and he goes on that fleet himself, and he was never seen or heard from again. And so the assumption is they ended up in the Western Hemisphere. But this is in the 13th century. Now the Olmec civilization is 3,000 years before that, so there really wouldn't be a relationship. It was seen that there were multiple migrations from Africa to the Americas over the millennia. I mean, after all, if there could be multiple European migrations, and Africa is closer to America than Europe is, and the currents from West Africa take you to America whether you like it or not, it seems only logical that Africans, including people from the Mali Empire, could have very easily ended up in ancient America. I think the only reason we question a lot of these things is because we have such a dim vision of Africa. As if to say Europeans could do these things, or Asians could do it, but how could these dim-witted Africans do these things? Because we have been entrenched with this idea that Africans are somehow intellectually inferior, that they don't have the capacity to do anything. I say all the time that what we must do is change our perception of Africa. I've lectured in 66 countries. I've lectured all over the world, all kinds of audiences. And typically I start by asking people, I mentioned this last night, just to break the ice, what do you think of when you think of Africa? And people always give me three answers consistently. They give me many answers, but three in particular. One is poverty. Two is wild animals. and 3 is disease. So you have an overwhelmingly negative attitude about Africa. And if you're a person like me of direct African heritage, that means you have a negative attitude about yourself. We had a man named Malcolm X who used to say, you can't hate the roots of a tree without hating the fruits of the tree. So we want to change our perception of Africa. Otherwise, we're never going to move forward, and people will continue to be ashamed of Africa, even Africans themselves. I know there are some of us who would rather be called turds in a toilet than an African, because we've been taught that Africa is the worst place in the world. But Europeans don't have that shame about Europe. And Asians tend not to have that shame about Asia. But with Africa, we have all kinds of issues that much of it comes from a lack of self-esteem that can only come from a knowledge of self. When Europeans talk about history, they glorify it. They talk about Aristotle. They talk about Plato. They talk about Isaac Newton. When Africans talk about Africa, they talk about tribes. So we are handicapped. We don't have a level playing field. So we are always in a defensive position. And we apologize for it. No more apologies. We don't have anything to be ashamed of. We don't have to explain this to anybody. If you don't like it, hit the road, Jack. In fact, a lot of this is a discussion that Africans need to have for themselves. Just as Africans. Before you could talk about making the world a better place, before you could talk about interracial dialogue, Africans themselves must have a dialogue among African people. And stop apologizing for it. Stop trying to make everybody feel welcome at your own expense. And you see, that makes people feel very uncomfortable because they actually want to control the dynamic. They don't think Africans should be able to speak for themselves. They don't think African people should have the last word on the history and future of Africa. They feel a need to control that dynamic. And I sense that same mentality.
The question is about your own historical development of your consciousness. So I don't know if you were born in a conscious environment, or you came from conscious parents, or kind of what were the
Just the
moments-
opposite of that.
What, like most Black Americans, I would say,
I'm an African in America.
or an African in America. I think we're talking about the same people.
No, we're not talking about the same thing.
Okay.
I don't like the word Black America.
Okay, then African in America. So as an African in America, can you kind of chart maybe 3 or 4 experiences where you kind of came into your own consciousness?
A lot of it was the time that I grew up in. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. And when I was 14 years old, I had the good fortune of attending, I think, the first or second Negro history class. We had a class called Negro history at that time. Not even Black history, not even African history. And I had a very good teacher. It's funny how you remember certain teachers 40, 50 years back. Okay? And this teacher used to bring the speeches of Malcolm X and play them in LP form. I don't even know if people know what an LP is anymore. You know, these black things, they're in a circle, and you put them on a record player and you put a needle on it. So he used to bring speeches by Malcolm X, and Malcolm X used to say one thing in particular that really stood out to me. He used to say, of all our studies, it is history that is most qualified to reward our research. That was pivotal for me. And then when I went to high school, I started reading Marcus Garvey. And then an interesting thing happened. I got accepted to several universities, scholarships and all that. I was very fortunate. And I decided at the last minute not to go to university after all, that I was going to join the Army. I had a brother-in-law who was in the U.S. Marine Corps. I admired him. He was my hero. And so I decided I wouldn't go to the university after all, but I would join the military, the U.S. military. But I had won a scholarship, and I wanted that money. I had worked hard for it. I feel like it was mine. So in order to get the scholarship, in order to get the money, I had to register for class. I had to register. But by the time I registered, most of the other classes were already full. The biology courses, all of that was full. So the only classes that were available to me were the Pan-African Studies classes. And my life changed dramatically because I met people who referred to other black people as sister and brother, where we talked about Africa openly. And I had one teacher who I really admired, and she gave me an extra credit assignment, and that was to go hear a man named Stokely Carmichael at the time. He later changed his name to Kwame Ture. And I was mesmerized. For the first time, I heard the word Pan-Africanism, and then I joined a study group. And the first book we studied was called The Destruction of Black Civilization, which is a very, very important book. Because this book not only mentions that we had a history before slavery and before colonization, but that African people, that the African diaspora began thousands of years before we were enshackled and enslaved. And so I knew even then that I wanted to find out what happened to those black people, those Africans who left Africa a long time ago. And so from the time I was 18, I'm 63 now, so this is 45 years ago, I knew that I wanted to be a historian. And I really haven't looked back.
I had some information that there was once upon a time that not only did Africa or Africans rule or govern the whole of Africa, but they also governed Europe and Asia, or practically lots of the world. And there was a revolution somewhere that, of course, brought the African rule down and turned things around.
Certainly there was a time when the continent that we call Africa was very, very influential in Europe and Asia as well. And that's not hard to imagine. I mean, we've just come out of the era of the British Empire. They used to say the British Empire was so vast and so would never sit on it. The Commonwealth all over. India, Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. And the French Empire was very, very large. So it's not hard to imagine the influence or presence of African people in parts of the world today that we don't associate African people. So that's I think, a pretty logical conclusion that we could draw. Yeah.
I see a lot of information, like for instance with the Dogons, that can't be explained on how we see this physical information that we have. I see it in Kemet and I see it in many other places. That there's no real explanation as to how we got this information. So from the historical information that you've come through, what's your take on how we came across this information? How did we get hold of such information before like modern day tools could have been made to get this information?
I think there are other ways of knowing that perhaps we haven't even explored. I think that sometimes we limit ourselves, we kind of pigeonhole ourselves. And we have to be far more open-minded about how knowledge is acquired. That there are many ways, I suppose, of acquiring knowledge. And we don't have to limit it to one way or one source. Now, a lot of you all are younger than me, okay? I think of myself as a teacher, okay? And I think that the mark of a good teacher is when their students surpass them. There's an African proverb that goes something like, wisdom is not like gold dust to be tied up in a sack and hidden away. So I expect you to learn from my experiences and to grow from there. I pride myself on having visited 120 countries now in search of the African presence. And the reason for that is I began that quest is because a person that had a big influence on me intellectually, a man from Jamaica named Jay Rogers, I was told visited 60 countries. And I was in my 30s at the time. And I said to myself, my God, how could anybody go that many places? And I decided that if he could go to 60 countries, in spite of the racism that he encountered at that time, this is in the 20s and 30s, that I should be able to go to at least 65. And I got to 60 and 65 and 70 and 75, and I didn't see any reason to stop. And I got to 80 and I got to 100, and that was a big deal to me. And now I'm at 120. So I would hope that there were people who will go beyond that and say that they were influenced and inspired by Runoko Rashidi and applied his lessons and went on and surpassed that. And somewhere from the ancestral realm, Runoko is smiling at you and saying, keep going. Because we don't have all the answers. But that doesn't mean we are not capable of achieving those answers or seeking those answers. So a lot of things we don't know, but that doesn't mean we're incapable of knowing.
Good doctor.
Thank you.
Yesterday I followed the presentation. It was very nice. Formerly, I and most of the African, we used to begin the history of Africa with slavery or colonization. But yesterday you went very deeply in the history and present us the presence of Africa everywhere in the world. The presence of Africa in Europe, in Asia, and even in America before Columbus, it means that the African society is a society of migration. We are going from place to place. What pushes us to leave our continent to go to other continents all the time?
Many reasons. I think you could say that history is the movements of people. And those movements are obviously driven by many factors. Could be drought, could be overpopulation, just a desire to explore and what is on the other side of the hill. So I think that's a very, very basic question, and Africans are not immune from that. There are many material factors that lead to migrations. So that's, I think, pretty basic. And you could ask that about any people, not just African people. But I think we are inspired by the so-called great explorers, by Marco Polo, by Ibn Battuta, by others. I just, again, think that Africa has been so stigmatized and pigeonholed that we are not able, for the most part, to see Africans as explorers. Africans who journey to other parts of the world. That's kind of unusual for a lot. We just, speaking generally, are not used to seeing Africans in that light. I would dare say that the average African American it would be difficult for them to name one African who lived before slavery. We have in the United States a short window of time called February, Black History Month, and we talk about African American heroes. So we would know about Frederick Douglass, and we would know about Martin Luther King, and we would know about people like Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks, etc., great athletes and entertainers. But we have a history that goes beyond that. And what you have in your psyche is the view that our history started with slavery. So you are handicapped from the beginning. I think that we could follow the logic that if you think your history began with slavery, or you think your history began with colonization, then it's not unusual to develop the mentality that the best you will hope to be is a good slave or a colonial subject. So you must break that barrier down. And you must look at Africa again as the birthplace of humankind, as the birthplace of human culture, as the birthplace of civilization. And it is only after that point that Africa begins to be invaded, and you have the decline of Africa, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. And so I'm asking you to see the big picture. There's another African proverb. I love to use these African proverbs, and I don't say a Somali proverb or a Kenyan proverb or Tanzanian proverb. You know, we're talking about building African unity and forging a new sense of African identity. And it goes, I pointed out the stars, but all you saw were the tips of my fingers. So I want you to be able to see the stars. I want you to be able to see the big picture. I want you to be the one that defines your reality based on your perspective and not somebody else's perspective that doesn't have your best interest at heart, but their own best interest at heart.
Please.
Can I add something?
It is in the same process, but could we reach such targets if we are using the language of other people?
Oh, that's an excellent question. But right now, those are the languages that we have to work with. So I think that we need to pursue that. But I think you make an excellent point. Give you an example. On my first trip to Australia, I was with the so-called Aboriginal people, indigenous people, and I spent a lot of time with them. And I would ask them questions that never seemed, the way they explained it would never make sense to me. I would ask, for example, what does it mean to be an Aboriginal? How is Aboriginal or indigenous identity defined? And they would say, well, first you must have a skin name. And no matter how they explained skin name, it never made sense to me. And they would say you must have a creation story, which is a story of how you came to be. And they would explain it to me, and it never made sense to me. And I came to the conclusion that they were trying to explain to me these very deep and profound concepts in a language that is not their own, in a language that is really not my own. And I think that that meant that I could never really fully understand. All right, so you make a very good point. Now you have a linguist in the room. Perhaps you could briefly address that.
I'm very passionate kind of campaign for the development of African languages. I campaign for the promotion of African languages. And I think that it is very crucial. I mean, some of I talk about I agree with you on many things you say. And some of the argument, they will say, well, when you talk about language, people will say, well, there are too many languages in Africa. I discount that. You know, we must find a way to develop, every African child should be able to read and write in his mother tongue. That's in his or her mother tongue. This is clear. This is principle number one. And then we can think of developing lingua franca, some major African languages which we can use. So I think that, I mean, there is nothing, I mean, it's a number one condition for even talking about identity, talking about, you know, the kind of things that you say. So language is very important in this case. I mean, I have talked a lot about this, so I won't go further. This is your evening. I don't want to take your evening from you.
No, well, let me just say, you have one of the world's foremost African scholars right here living here. You know, he's a real resource. You should take full advantage of. And I think he's much nicer than me, and he's much more mellow than I am, so you could probably go farther with him than you can with me. Mm-hmm.